Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our official launch of the Rivers Trust's State of Our Rivers report. Welcome to everybody who's joining us on the webinar and to those of you who are also watching us on YouTube. Just giving a minute or two for everybody to settle in, and then we will kick off. Okay. So just for those of you in the webinar, some quick housekeeping notes. We'd love to have some interaction with you. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. You can also use the chat function. And just so that you all know that this is being live streamed and recorded. And we'd love you to invite everybody to find out more about the report and tweet and share lots of information about this using the hashtag State of Our Rivers. So we're really excited to bring this new report to you today. It feels like it's more of a resource than a report because you can only use it online. It's supposed to be very interactive, and what we're trying to do is kind of bring into everybody's reach some of the data that we hold at a national level, most of it government data, but things that people don't always have access to. So we kind of know many of the headlines, you know, only 14% of our rivers are in good ecological health around the country. But what we really want to emphasize with this report and this new resource is what can be done about it and what does that look like in your river. So we've got lots of detailed information in this online resource so that you can dig in and find out what's happening on your river, what's the state of your river, and what kinds of things are being measured there. This is one example of how we kind of dig into the detail. We've got these, what we've been calling nerd buttons, these blue buttons throughout the report, where the report is really constructed in lots of layers. You can dig in and find out a lot more information. So please go in, play around. That's your sandpit. Dig into your nerd buttons and find out what's going on. Some that many of you will already be familiar with. Links to sewer overflows. This is from one of those kind of nerd buttons that links to our sewage map that shows you really specific detail, how many times a particular sewer was overflowing into your river. But the report also focuses on some of the solutions as well and allows you to dig in and find out how those are being implemented around the country too. So we talk a lot about nature-based solutions, bringing nature back in to try and resolve the big crisis that we're seeing played out in our rivers, our nature crisis and the coming climate crisis that we're not ready for because of the polluted state of many of our rivers. So the report also helps you to understand what steps are already being taken and what more can we do. Today, to talk about the report, we've got a fabulous panel of people who have had a quick overview of the report because it's, of course, only gone live and online today. But I'd really like to welcome the panel. This is who we've got, and we'll be talking to them right now. We've got Mark Lloyd, our CEO. We've got Minister Rebecca Powell from DEFRA. We've got Philip Dunn, MP. The Member of Parliament for Ludlow, and sorry, that's decided to take us off now. So maybe the panelists can start turning on their videos as I carry on with the introductions. We've got Kerry Ann Payne, who is a world champion open water swimmer and now trains the trainers with open water swimming. Got Olivia Blake, our Shadow Minister for Nature, and Charles Watson, who is the lead of the River Action UK, another very active NGO. We've got Joe Leyland, sorry, I'm mixing my names up, John Leyland, our Director of Water with the Environment Agency, and Joe Crowley, known to many of us as a presenter on Country File, also does quite a lot of work with Panorama as well. So thanks so much to all our panelists for joining us, and welcome to you. And because time is short, I'm going to be asking you to keep your responses quite short so that we've got time to cover a lot of the ground that's covered in this report. And I'd like to kick off with Kerry-Ann. And you've had a quick overview of this report. And as someone who's very involved with the open water swimming community, I mean, a leading figure in that community and training the trainers there, we've seen a massive explosion in terms of a new kind of use of our rivers during lockdown. When the gyms were closed, everybody gritted their teeth and kind of braved into the cold water of our rivers. So this report, how do you think this is going to help the general river user and the groups that really want to get a lot more use out of our rivers?
For me, it's actually really exciting. I feel like it's an extra layer of education for the coaches who can pass that extra layer from a safety perspective, but also an environmental perspective to their swimmers. You know, I've qualified this in the last 2 years during the pandemic, over 280 coaches, which is amazing and crazy that many people want to do that, but they're coaches and they're going to be going out coaching other people to swim. Loads of that's happening in rivers. So for me, it's terrifying, obviously, to read it. I think everyone can agree with that. But it's exciting that there are things that we can do. And as a network of coaches who are just so passionate about keeping our waters clean, I feel like they're going to be some really big advocates for making sure that those big changes are done.
Great, thanks, Kerry-Ann, thank you. So the report, of course, highlights where the problems lie. And a lot of these have been assessed by the Environment Agency. They've been attributing reasons to failure to different activities and different sectors. And the sector that's causing the most widespread failure of our rivers in terms of ecological health is agriculture. So activities happening within agriculture and the rural areas are really having the most widespread impact. And I'd like to come to Minister Rebecca Powell and bring to you a question that came to us. We invited the public and followers on social media to submit questions in advance of this session. And we've had one from Dave Tickner at WWF that asks, you know, why do you think successive governments have found it so difficult to stop agricultural pollution from getting into our rivers? And I'd just like to add to that by, you know, saying, is it, do we think that the new ELMS, the Environment Land Management Scheme, is going to make a difference?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm very delighted to be here. And actually, I've had a good look at your report, which I welcome. I actually have been, you know, at pains since being the Environment Minister, Water Minister, to pull all this together too. And I've actually made improving our water quality one of my top priorities. And it, you know, highly necessary. That's not to say in the past, you know, there hasn't been a great deal of work, but there's a great deal more to do. And I would also like to say it isn't just agriculture. There are a range of sources, of course, but the influence of one or another source varies wherever you are. And we do have sources from sewage treatment works. That's where we get this phosphate issue, which I'm working very hard on. And we have the sources from agriculture. We also have urban diffuse pollution from runoff from the pollution from tyres that sweep down our drains and so forth. So it's quite a complicated picture. But just to go back to agriculture, yes, but we have strict rules and regulations and permitting system for agriculture in terms of if you want to set up an enterprise, a commercial enterprise, a chicken farm or so forth, you have to go through the EA. We have a series of enforcements. We also have our farming rules for water. But what we are really focusing on is is in making sure those are enforced and adhered to. We are now really upping the ante, working with farmers in terms of just the whole way they farm. And you talked about elms. Yes, there will be lots of opportunities to move into this whole system of integrated pest management. Farmers will be paid to look after the environment in the countryside, produce public benefits, which of course clean water is definitely one of them, so that they will use less inputs, less fertilizers, more extensive ways of working. We're going to introduce our slurry investment grant next year. So more farm. I come from a farming background, so I absolutely understand this, and I also understand their challenges of getting rid of the slurry from their systems. So we've got a lot more EA inspectors that we've just allocated funding for, and I think you touched on catchments. You mentioned catchments, didn't you? We've just allocated another £17 million for a lot more catchment advisors. And the one thing that I really am aware of is farmers want to do the right thing, but they need to know exactly what to do. And through the pots of money through ELMS, our huge landscape recovery network that we're rolling out, there will be much more opportunity to work with the farmers and all the partners in a catchment, for example, to reduce the inputs into the land and, importantly, what runs off into our rivers. So what I really want to stress on this call is we're working at pace, and it is a priority. And I'm really, really delighted to hear Kerry speaking, Kerry Ann, and I hope she welcomes our first inland bathing water quality area that has been allocated up there in Ockley. But we do have obviously very good bathing water quality around our coast, and monitoring and data is so important. Information and data, and we've really upped that in terms of what data people can get hold of, what the water companies are reporting. They now have to report real-time data around our coasts, which I'm absolutely delighted about. And there's going to be more requirements for water companies to do real-time monitoring when they use those storm sewage overflows. So the whole, I would say, landscape is really changing and improving.
Thank you, Minister. I'd like to come to Olivia Blake now and also give you the opportunity, because you know, from what you've heard the Minister saying, do you think that these various schemes, and particularly ELMS, is going to go far enough? I mean, one of our calls to action has been that we actually need a simplification and a synchronization of a lot of these many different schemes that at the moment seem to be missing each other, because we're still seeing huge impacts from diffuse pollution. So if you were rolling out your schemes, what would you be doing differently?
Well, thank you, Christine, and thank you for the invite this morning. And just to echo what Rebecca said about welcoming this resource, which is really, really exciting to see, and something that I think that which should be in the public availability already. But I think the way that it is able to communicate the different issues, whether that's biodiversity in our rivers or chemicals or pollutants of other kinds, it's really great to see. I think that we need to have an honest conversation about where we are. We know that we have a very difficult water system, and one that is currently not immune to the threats that are kind of currently polluting it. And I can see in the chat that someone's put about chemicals and forever chemicals, and that being a really critical issue as well in this. But I think that it's quite clear that, you know, obviously we've got the Environment Bill coming through, and we welcome ELMS. ELMS is a great idea. However, we're not very clear what that's going to look like and what the difference is going to be that's made. I'm also very, very keen to push that we need to see much more nature-based solutions to help alleviate the risks of flooding and the risks of using the overflows, which we know has a lasting impact and is very polluting. And I think that it's definitely for government to go away and think of their solutions, but as the party and as spokesperson for the Labour Party, we're very, very keen that we get consumers and actually democratise this information and make sure that local people can see what's happening in their areas, and make sure that they can hold people to account for it as well. And I think that's a really, really important strand, which I think is currently missing. So we want to enable communities to have much more say over what is happening in their local areas and in their waters. But I think we have to be honest, if we don't improve biodiversity as well, we're going to be seeing a significant risk to the climate as well. They're interlocked and interconnected. So I think there's a huge amount of regulations that could come forward. I think the EA could be doing a lot more to support farmers to make the right choices, and the regulatory framework, whilst it seems quite robust, has been difficult for them to implement because of the lack of resources, which Rebecca has just said is going to get a boost, but how much that will improve things is yet to be seen. So I hope that gives a flavour of kind of like the direction that we would like to go in. We would like to actually set ambition challenges to ourselves for the quality of the water in our rivers, and make sure that we're meeting those robustly. So yeah, I'll stop talking now.
Thanks, Olivia. I mean, Charles, I'd like to come to you now, because you've been very active in one of our catchments that's really been suffering in terms of agricultural pollution in the Wye. And I think many of the audience will have also seen George Monbiot's Riverside documentary that highlighted the failures of cumulative impact assessment, and the fact that we're really looking at this in such a piecemeal way, and that's not helping. So from your experience of trying to tackle agricultural pollution on the Wye, what do you think is going wrong? Where are the big problems?
Well, Christine, I mean, firstly, congratulations on producing this report. But I mean, to me, the real question everyone should be asking itself is, what will the legacy of this report be? I mean, will it be a documentation of the amazing work that people like the Rivers Trust do, across the country to restore catchments, turning those red rivers blue? Or will this report become an obituary column for rivers that go red and die? Because I was down on the Wye last week for 2 days. I travelled from Chepstow up to Hay, stopping at various places. That river is dying. In 2 years, the entire ranunculus water crowfoot, the weed system that is the starting point of the whole ecosystem, has disappeared, and it has effectively become an open sewer for 20 million chickens that are industrially produced, within the catchment. And this has happened unchecked by planners who've allowed this one of the biggest concentrations of intensive agriculture in Europe to just appear in a few years. And it has been unchecked by regulators on both sides of the government agencies on both sides of the rivers. And whilst the minister makes all the right noises, I mean, we mustn't ignore the fact that in the last 10 years, enforcement actions against polluters have fallen by 95%. Environmental funding has collapsed by 75%. The farming rules for water were mentioned, but according to a Freedom of Information request in February this year, of the 243 violations reported by the EA, not one enforcement action has been taken. And it is a matter of urgency, because that amazing piece of work you do, which could be an incredible resource for the citizen scientists of this, the country, the people who are restoring catchments, it could just be a horrible story of increased decline in the rivers. And you go to the Wye and there is nothing positive to be seen, and it is a horror show.
Yeah,
sorry to be depressing, but
absolutely, no, it certainly looks that way. And so John, I'd like to come to you now, because we're hearing a lot around enforcement, and we also had a question on social media from Ian Blewett, asking about how are we going to see the EA resourced to be able to enforce and meet its requirements. And I noticed on the Q&A, there was also a question from Rachel Salvage saying, why are these critical posts in the EA only temporary at the moment? So John, I know you're 1 month in your new position. Do you have the resources that you need? Because the role that you play is so critical in making sure that this isn't an obituary, that this is a kind of call to action, and that we can all move in the right direction.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you for inviting me today. I too have really enjoyed and welcome your report. I don't mind telling you that I let my inner nerd loose this morning and had a look at the rivers in my area. It was a really engaging and interactive way to see really important data. Ian asks an important question, and Charles put it quite pointedly, that more enforcement needs to be done. And of course, the Environment Agency can do more with more. It is a matter of public record that our finances for this activity have dropped from around 120 million in 2010 down to 40 million in 2020. But as Minister said, we are getting extra money this year to support farmers and to work with farmers. As one farmer said to me, it's really hard to be green when we're in the red. And I think farmers do need support because most of them are passionate environmentalists and want to do the right thing. And part of our job, part of all of our job, and I think indeed this is one of the thrusts of the report, is we do need to work together on this to support farmers to make good choices, because they will. We also have a big responsibility with our water companies who spend billions on improving the water environment, but are almost equal in terms of the worst causes of pollution. And again, I welcome the open data and the transparency. I think it was Olivia who said democratizing data is really important. It gives us a better opportunity to focus where not only the biggest offences happen, which is where the Environment Agency focuses its enforcement activity, but also where there are other offences where we may be able to use more moderate measures, such as enforcement sanctions, where we can, instead of taking a full legal prosecution where the money goes to Treasury and doesn't come back to the environment, we can work through a legal framework with third parties to put the money that we get from the polluter straight back into the environment. And that's been very successful over recent years. And again, we would like to see more than that. The last point I would make is it's not just about more money. It's about our ability to use the money. We are in constrained times, public finances are tight, and quite rightly, the public expect to see what their money is getting for them in the environment. And sometimes that means that the money comes with a golden handcuff. It needs to be spent on this particular activity. Sometimes we can achieve far more through investing that money in partnerships. And again, the report points heavily to the value of partnerships. And I'll finish by saying for every £1 we invest in a partnership, we attract £2 of independent money to that outcome. So it is both economically, it is efficient, it's effective, and it's more equitable. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And Philip, I'd like to come to you now, because we've been talking a lot about agriculture, but of course the other sector that's having a huge impact is the water sector, impacting 55% of the rivers and causing them to fail in terms of environmental health. And we also had I'm not sure if it was in the comment or chat from Matt Wielden pointing out, we need to keep in mind the difference between ecological health and rivers that are fit to swim in, because they obviously need to meet different standards. On Twitter, we had a question from Windrush Against Sewage Pollution, WASP, that links to this pollution from water companies, but the upstream reasons for that, which are, why is the water industry still forced to take sewage from new housing developments, particularly into sewage works that are already failing and already working over capacity? So I think this is a point that your private members bill that you had hoped to introduce in the last session of Parliament, and of course it couldn't get heard because of various restrictions and COVID in particular. But that was seeking to take a much more holistic approach to dealing with the causes of the problem. So do you have a comment on that, around this automatic right to connect, and how are we going to tackle this upstream with new developments?
Sure. Well, Christine, thank you so much for including me in your panel today. And I just like to add my congratulations to the Rivers Trust alongside everybody else who's spoken about the quality of the report that you put together. One of the biggest challenges when I was looking 18 months or so ago now at trying to introduce some legislation was that there were requirements to produce data, a limited amount of data from water companies, but extracting that data was subject to great delay, so it was very out of date by the time it was made available. You needed to go through the full freedom of information as an individual or campaign group to try and get the data on what was happening in your local area. So a key tenet of my bill was to try and improve real-time data monitoring and make it publicly available, so that, that what was actually happening in our rivers was transparent to the public, because I felt, and I still believe, that that is the best way of forcing change in the sector, when people understand what's the damage that's being caused, as we heard from Charles in relation to the why. If it was publicly known the state of our rivers, as your report is making available so effectively today, I think it will become a much higher political priority. So the bill that I introduced last year was focused on the water companies, because I took the view that trying to get 10 water companies to change behaviour would have a better prospect of success than trying to persuade 90,000 farmers to change behaviour. We have to do both, but I wanted to focus it on the sector which was where I think it would be easier to effect change, because of course it was in a very heavily regulated environment, and we've heard about from the EA about how the role that they have in trying to enforce, and I completely agree with the comments that have been made that the EA requires a greater capacity to be able to enforce breaches, and that again is what this data will help to identify. But getting back to your question, I'm currently undertaking an inquiry through the Environmental Audit Committee into water quality, and I'm not going to preempt what our recommendations will be, but we had the Minister in front of us giving evidence last week, for which we're very grateful, and we have the water companies coming, 5 of the chief executives of the water companies coming before us on the 13th of October, and we will then make some recommendations. One of the issues that we've been highlighting through that inquiry is precisely the point that you're raising about new housing development adding to the pressure on the existing infrastructure, and yet at the moment there is very little obligation on developers to contribute to improving the infrastructure. The right to connect allows developments to connect up to the nearest available drainage system, whether that's a surface water or a foul water system, and that's contributing to the problem of sort of commingled water from runoff mingling with the sewers, which is leading to these storm overflows. So I think something needs to be done about that, and I think it's likely that we'll be recommending that the community infrastructure levy should apply to allow water companies to be able to improve necessary infrastructure if their system approach is not adequate to cope with the additional developments happening in a particular system.
And I mean, I know that we could probably talk about the sewage issues, but just a couple of more points on that, without kind of just diverting completely over to sewage ending up in our rivers, which is a huge public concern. We had a question on the Q&A from Stuart Singleton White asking, let me quickly directly refer to it so I don't misquote him, but we've seen so many amendments coming through the Environment Bill during the session within the House of Lords, and particularly the Duke of Wellington's amendment calling for more action, not just reporting. We are seeing a lot of strengthening in terms of transparency of information and more reporting. But this amendment is putting a duty on government and water companies to actually stop discharging. So there are big concerns, and we've been hearing concerns on the social media chat as well about the shift from exceptional circumstances to water companies being able to discharge infrequently. That seems like a weakening of the legislation. Do you have a comment to make on whether we can see a much stronger environment bill than we're seeing at the moment?
Well, I think to give credit to the government, and particularly to Minister Rebecca Powell, who's really championed this across government. The Environment Bill, which is coming out of the Lords, before I get onto the remaining amendments, is far stronger than it was when it entered the Commons in terms of these issues, and looking to place water quality much higher up the priority list for government action. So there is within the bill, and there are a number of government amendments that have been put down to include a requirement for water companies to monitor and report in almost real time on the quality of the receiving waters where treatment works and storm overflows with the outfalls into the river from those facilities. That's going to make a huge difference to improving the sort of data that you're providing through this report today is historic data based on a snapshot, I think in most cases taken once a year. In future, once this bill is enacted and enforced and water companies are invested in the data capture systems that they will have to do, we will find you'll be able to get this sort of data in close to real time, which will completely transform the public's understanding of the state of their rivers at any moment in time. If they want to go fishing, they can have a look at what the state of the river is before they get there, and they will see if there's been a discharge in the previous 24 hours, for example. So I think the bill is doing a lot of really good stuff, and I'd like to pay tribute to the Minister for the tenacious way that she's championed these issues within her department and across government. But of course, there are a few amendments in particular. You referenced the Duke of Wellington's amendment for to place an additional duty on water companies to strengthen up what does look as though is being watered down from the ability to use storm overflow systems in exceptional circumstances. There's no question that they're now being used routinely, and that's for a whole myriad of reasons. But I think we need to get back to a situation where water companies are not discharging other than for exceptional events which would otherwise lead to flooding back up the pipe network and flooding people's homes with sewage, which we obviously don't want to see happen.
Yeah, thank you, Philip, and we look forward to the recommendations coming out of the Environment Audit Committee inquiry. I'm sure that that's going to be really powerful as well. Joe, I'd like to come to you now, because you probably, well, certainly more than the average Joe and the rest of us, get to travel around the country making all your fabulous programs and talking to such a wide variety of people, including farmers, but the general public as well. One of the conclusions of this report is that in terms of our race to resilience, we think that the role of rivers is really important, and that the problems that we're seeing now are going to be exacerbated by the impacts of climate change with more extreme events. Do you have a sense from the people that you're talking to in the work that you're doing, are people aware of the state of our rivers? And is there a general awareness how important rivers are in terms of climate change and our defences against climate impacts?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. Lovely to take part. I think probably to reflect on that, the answer is a slightly gloomy one. Of course, when I go and speak to farmers and businesses and various people, they are very aware of the impact of climate change and the problems coming up. I don't think generally, hand on heart, I can say that people are linking it to the health of rivers. So this week I was filming a farm where they started vertical farming pak choy and salad leaves and all this kind of stuff. They are doing it because their suppliers want more uniform salad leaves that aren't tainted by either pesticides or heavy rain, you know, putting soil up onto the leaves and all that kind of stuff. Actually, what they're doing is brilliant for rivers because they're using rainwater, they're recycling, they're using hydroponics, everything is contained, there are no nutrients going into rivers, and it's a very good news story. But that's not why they're doing it. They're doing it first and foremost for sort of very commercial reasons. So I think we need to get further along the line in making people realise sort of how resilient rivers can help. I would like to go back, I'm going to do what sort of politicians do here, and I normally criticise them for doing, and go back and just have a comment on the data, if I may, because I welcome, you know, hearing Minister Powell saying data is really important, and Philip Dunn's work on this as well. But I think we have to be really honest. The data we have right now is a shadow of what we should have. You know, the elephant in the room is this data is appalling, it is terrible, and predominantly that's because our national regulator, the state, has sort of abdicated its responsibility in this area. As John was saying, the Environment Agency's budget has been terribly cut. So routine water testing simply isn't happening. And you speak to Environment Agency enforcement officers and they will tell you most of their job now is justifying why they do not attend pollution incidents that the public are calling them about. They are not finding those pollution incidents for themselves because they're not taking samples. And if they're not taking samples, as we all know, a slurry incident or a sewage spill happens, and within a day or two, it's washed down the river. They're missing those acute things. We can pick up on the chronic to some extent, but I don't think we're even picking up on that. But the data is really poor. I applaud what the Rivers Trust has done because the data that is available is brilliantly represented, and I think it's great that people can go in and have a look at all these various maps. However, if you were to look at that map and say, oh, it looks like not much sewage was spilled in my river last year, then I would question that, because actually this is based on the water companies providing data, not the state getting it independently. The water companies providing data. We know in cases like Southern Water that water companies have deliberately falsified that data. That has happened. And there is a big question mark over how much an industry that is struggling to cope and hasn't invested over the last generation can actually mark its own homework. And they're the crumbs we're dealing with this data. That is what we're looking into. And to be honest, you know, when we looked at it for Panorama, we were finding things like Mogden, you know, it engaged in criminal behaviour. The Thames Water, they were illegally dumping sewage on a really regular basis last year. The Environment Agency were not picking up on that. I don't know what has happened in that case. And when we look at, I'll give one more example and I'll be quiet, but when we looked at some data for one particular water company that had 600 sewage works, if you ask the Environment Agency, how many breaches have there been over the last 10 years for this company with 600 sewage works, the answer was 4. But when we looked at data for just 1 year and only 4 sewage works, and credit to Professor Peter Hammond here, we could identify 70 breaches in just 1 year in just 4 works. So I think that shows you that we just have no idea. I don't have an idea. None of the panel have an idea. The government doesn't have an idea because the data simply isn't there. And the one thing we have to do is turn that round, and actually the state has to start taking water quality samples reliably and regularly.
Thanks for raising that point, Joe. And it's something that we do try and emphasize in the report, is that the data that we're sharing is likely to be an underreporting. You know, we know that only 80% of the CSOs for that particular instance are monitored anyway, and that this is data that's reported by the water companies into government and into the Environment Agency. And there currently isn't capacity to verify all of that data. So I think the requirements in the Environment Bill for much more real-time data are going to be a really important addition to that. But I'd just like to give both John and Minister Powell an opportunity to respond to those important points about, you know, the level of enforcement can only be as good as the data that it's based on. And at the moment, there are big gaps there. Would you like to respond to that?
Sorry, I wasn't sure who you were bringing in first. Did you?
Minister, would you like to respond first, and then I'll bring John in?
Yeah, and thank you for all the comments. And yeah, well, I flagged, that's why in the Environment Bill, we have amendments, we have government amendments, and we've taken on board a lot of the points that Philip Dunn was talking about earlier. And of course, I'd worked on that myself a great deal behind the scenes as a backbencher before I became a minister. So I'm really pleased we're getting these things into the Environment Bill, absolutely critical. The extra monitoring, the real-time monitoring for water companies to monitor and report on the use of these storm sewage overflows is absolutely crucial. There'll be a requirement for them to monitor sewage treatments up and downstream of the facility, and then to report on actions to eliminate these storm sewage overflows. And we've been working very closely with the Duke of Wellington as well. So I'm confident that we're going to get much more of this data that we need, because quite frankly, once we know that, enforcement will be easier, but all the other measures that we're taking as a government through ELMS, through the Sustainable Farming Initiative, through the work I'm doing with the Storm Overflows Task Force, the Chalk Streams Restoration Group and the Nutrients Task Force, which I'm working with the Planning Housing Minister on in terms of what goes into the water from our housing developments. And that brings in that whole issue of the connections to the system and the surface, the SUDs, which is so absolutely critical. So we're doing so much work on that. The whole landscape is changing, and we've also given a much stronger steer to Ofwat, which was mentioned just now. I think you mentioned it yourself, Chair, in terms of putting the environment much higher up the agenda, and this whole issue of sewage storm overflows and everything else that's interconnected. But what I also wanted to reiterate, it is also about partnership working. Government makes policies, Ofwat is the regulator, we're working with all this, but we also need to work with all organisations in these partnerships to deliver a cleaner, more sustainable environment. And I do want to commend the Rivers Trust, because your work on the catchment partnership side is so important, and that's why I felt it was really important to get more catchment advisors. And everything I do in terms of my flood management role and flood risk and nature and biodiversity, nature-based solutions, all feed into this whole issue of partnership working and working on a much wider catchment-based scale to tackle what's happening in our rivers. And I'm confident we will do it, but we do need to work together. So I think I'll leave there, but my messaging is, and also please, we want citizens to input, and also I'd really welcome any further interaction with the Rivers Trust. As you know, I've already met with you and so forth, but very happy to keep engaging, as I have with all of the people that have come to me, Professor Hammond and so on, and Philip Dunn, who I can't commend enough for his work, because I would say we've very much worked together on this. So I hope I'm leaving that on a more positive note than people on the call are making, because we have to give the right steers, and I do believe that is what we're doing.
Thank you, Minister. So, John, if I can come to you, it sounds like we're going to have a lot more data, but are you going to be able to put that data to good effect? Are you going to be able to use it for enforcement?
Thanks, Christine, and thanks for posing the question, Joe. So a word on enforcement. The Environment Agency does attend the most serious pollution incidents. As resources reduced, we've had to change our business model. So we work more upstream now. Our goal is to try and prevent pollution in the first place, work more with industry and business to prevent the causes of pollution. But where pollution does happen, we do take action. Earlier this year, around July, where Southern Water were found by a court to have recklessly polluted, we achieved a record-breaking £90 million fine against that business. Earlier this year, we prosecuted successfully Thames Water for £4 million and £2.3 million separately. So we do take action where we can, and enforcement does remain a deterrent. But could we do more with more? Yes.
Thanks, John. Mark, I'd like to come to you now, because well, first of all, on the data point, we're hearing about more resources being made available for government, but very often it's citizens, it's recreational groups, and it's even other businesses that might have better access and be able to be more responsive to what's going on their stretch of river. Can you talk a little bit about how that could strengthen what's already being planned by government?
Yes, I mean, I think what we're trying to do, and we're very much promoting our catchment monitoring cooperative concept, which is trying to bring together all the different sources of data that currently sit separately, and to bring them together onto a single platform, which can be interpreted in the kind of the way that we've done in the State of the Rivers report, but to present that in a user-friendly format, so that everyone has access to pooled data collected on a single framework. So we're hopeful we will secure funding for that soon, and I think that's what it's all about, is trying to bring all of that together into a joint platform, so that we have really big data rather than lots of discrete and often not analysed data platforms. And citizens can play a huge role in that. The cost of monitoring equipment has plummeted, and people can go out and collect really high quality data, which is reliable, with suitable training.
Thanks. And I mean, you've just cycled 500 miles from Abergavenny up to Glasgow, which will of course will be the home of COP26. And so you cycled through, and you had quite a close experience with, being closer to the road than if we're just whizzing through on a normal journey, and closer to the rivers that you've seen. So were there examples where you're seeing rivers in recovery, and some of the solutions that we're proposing actually bringing good results?
Yeah, it was interesting to see new parts of the country I hadn't been to before. What I'd say is it's a curate's egg. It's good in parts. I saw quite a lot of rotten parts, and actually it was mainly looking at the land rather than looking at rivers, which kind of was most telling. And I saw, riding through the uplands, I could see areas which, very small areas, but very significant soil erosion from grazing of livestock, and obviously very heavy rain you get in the hills. And you can see these sort of deep gullies where huge amounts of soil have been washed out, but also that tells a story about vast amounts of water rushing down, which of course will be flooding people downstream. So those were areas where I think, you could take action to slow the flow. And similarly, maize and wheat and stubble turnips, being planted in places which are, quite high up with high rainfall on steep slopes, that's going to cause flooding and pollution downstream. I went through farms where, there was manure lying around all over the farmyard, and it was very dry, thankfully, when I was bicycling, but that, when it rains, all that manure is going to flush into the river, bring a load of ammonia and phosphates and nitrogen and biological oxygen demand into rivers, causing a lot of problems. I saw pesticides being sprayed at one point, and there was drift of the pesticides going into a ditch which will be connected to a river. Large parts of the Eden Valley, I noticed there was a sort of real stench of slurry and chicken manure being spread on fields which were kind of lurid green already, and they didn't look like they needed fertilizer. And it's really kind of just waste disposal going on from that kind of intensive production. Lots of canalized and blocked rivers, and desperately low flows. I mean, there's hardly any water in most of our rivers, all the way up the country, and a lot of algae on the stones, and this kind of sense of over nutrified rivers, both from sewage and agriculture. So that's quite a lot of sort of rotten bits of the egg, but there were some really good bits, and there's a lot of the land was managed really, really well, and there's a lot of farmers out there doing great stuff. You saw really good buffer strips in places. I saw some wonderful salt marshes on the Dee estuary, which are sequestering carbon and providing a fantastic resource for nature and people. With amazing cycle track through that. And lots of barriers being removed. I mean, on the Wye and the Severn, thousands of kilometres of river have been opened up by Rivers Trust working with partners. And riparian tree planting as well, going on a lot in really targeted areas, to slow the flow of water, to cool rivers from climate change, and to provide that kind of that riverside habitat. Lots of fencing of rivers to keep livestock out, which is really important. So my reflection on all of that is kind of, we need to do a lot more work on a more widespread basis to restore these natural processes, and particularly in sort of the integrity of the soil, and stopping soil and manure and chemicals getting into rivers by just restoring nature in some key strategic locations. And I think the data that we've got at the Rivers Trust enables us to kind of target those interventions at the places where they're going to have most impact. And so, I think there is, it's not all doom and gloom. There is some fantastic work going on out there. We just need a lot more of it, and to coordinate and target it better. But I would say, we really do need to see this enforcement of the rules and help the farmers, to advise them about, the best ways to manage the land.
Thanks, Mark. And I'd like to come to Philip now. Mark, you've touched on a lot of the issues of excessive nutrients in our rivers, and that's a huge cause for failure. I think the person who's posted the most questions here on the Q&A is Jeff Roberts, so I'm going to ask one of his, but linked to the more persistent chemicals like PFOSs, our so-called forever chemicals. This terrible legacy, much of which has come from our sort of industrial past, and includes a lot of mercury compounds around our rivers. This is one of the biggest reasons for failure of our rivers because of the poor chemical health. Philip, what's coming out of the EAC inquiry about these persistent chemicals, and do you think government's going to find a way to deal with that?
Well, thank you, Christine. So we are primarily focused on water quality issues coming out of the water companies, on sewage issues. But we have looked at, for example, the increasing evidence of microplastics, much of which come from domestic clothes washing machines, with fibres being flushed away and ending up on our riverbeds or in our in the invertebrates or the fish in our rivers. And so we may have some recommendations to make about this. I think we've not done a detailed look at the full range of toxic chemicals that are getting into our rivers. I think your report is highlighting a number of the most damaging ones. I mean, we are using materials, much of which contribute to water pollution in everyday life. And in one particular area, I think flame retardants is one of the areas that your report highlights. Well, we are doing a separate inquiry into sustainability of the built environment, where we're looking at building materials, many of which contain flame retardants for good reason, some of which have gone through legislative change or regulatory change in the last few years in order to remove some of the toxicity. And I would expect that inquiry may have something to say on this topic. It's a very challenging issue. I think to be fair, that the reduction in serious industrial pollution incidents in our rivers has been quite significant over the last few decades. What we're now looking at is some of the less visible consequences of the way we live our lives, and much of this comes down to innovation in consumer products, which has unforeseen consequences. So, introducing non-stick to cooking utensils leads to, as they get washed and reused, some of that material is flushed down the drains, and that can lead to accumulations of significant toxic chemicals in our waterways. So we've got to think quite holistically about this.
Thank you, Philip. Okay, well, I'd like to start sort of rounding off now, and I'd like to come back to Olivia and just think about, we've had our kind of take action section in this report and calling for action from government, business and individuals, highlighting some of the things that individuals can do as well. What do you think could be the next big catalyst that would really trigger a revival of our rivers? What would you like to see happening and just very briefly, what could happen next that would actually just set us off on the right trajectory?
A great question. And I think I'm hoping that well, I hope this isn't I'm not trying to dodge a question, but I think COP26 actually will get communities engaged with the wider issues of the climate crisis. And I'm hoping that the Environment Bill, which, obviously we welcome in part, but have great concerns about, and would like to see many of the amendments that have been won in the Lords maintained in it. I think that will start a discussion about this in the wider community, and I think the government's will have a lot of expectations from communities up and down the country who want to see improved water quality. And want to see nature returning to their rivers. You know, whilst it's great, we've got salmon in the Don in Sheffield, and you know that's not in a river that is of good enough quality at the moment. So it's definitely I think it's definitely about improving education around these events and making sure that water is heard throughout these discussions, and you know, I know that people are very, very passionate about catchment landscapes. I represent a peatland, you know, and peatlands, sorry, in the Peak District. And, you know, people are really engaging and wanting to see more biodiversity and nature. And this all interlinks so heavily with water quality. And we know that people like Kerry-Ann really want to use and have access to our water, our rivers and waterways, actually, in ways that we haven't probably traditionally in this country had. But, you know, absolutely, you know, I remember swimming in rivers from when I was a child, and I'm a bit horrified now I know what's been going on in our rivers. So I think it's definitely a moment for rivers, and I think that the more people understand actually what a good river looks like, and I think that's what's great about this tool, actually, is it shows you very clearly what people should be looking for, the better. And I think that will empower communities to really hold people like me and Rebecca to account, to make sure that we're prioritising the right things.
Great, thanks, Olivia. And Kerry-Ann, I'd like to come back to you as well. You know, in terms of your aspirations and ambitions for rivers and for our river health, and you know, what do you think could be the next big step that we could take towards a better state of rivers?
I think it's clear messaging to, yes, obviously all the stuff we've talked about is going to be helpful in making sure that, you know, the government are doing all they can to get the data and all that kind of stuff. But at the moment, we have a massive community around the UK, not just in the swimming, but environmentalists really keen to get stuck in and do something about it. So is there a way? For me, it would be amazing to try and figure out the clear single messaging that us, like normal people who can go down and swim in rivers and stuff, what is it that we can do? There's pockets of information happening here, there, and everywhere. And, you know, the Surfers Against Sewerage have done such a great job of creating beach cleans, and people know stuff they can do with that. And that's happening on beaches, but that's not happening in our rivers. There's obviously so much more to it. We can't just go down to any river and start picking out litter on it, because you've got to make sure that we're not interfering with any of the animals in the bank and all that kind of stuff. But I think locally, people really want to get stuck in. If there is a farm that is needing some help to create some stuff, there would be so many people really keen to get stuck in and plant the plants that need to be planted, or get rid of the stuff that needs to be gotten rid of, because we're running the risk, and you guys have said it in your report, like it's almost too late. I fully and wholeheartedly think that we definitely need to be pushing to get all the legislation to make sure we're enforcing things. But I don't feel like that's soon enough. But there's other things that we need to be doing now, as well as in the meantime, that stuff's still happening. So what is it that collectively as a group, we can all say, this is what we should be doing, this is how we need to be doing it? And it needs to come one clear message from the right place, rather than loads of little messages and little bits around, because it just gets missed. You know, you've talked about many chemicals, which I've never heard of, to be honest. And it kind of seems a bit overwhelming. And I can totally imagine someone going, oh, well, what can I do about it? There's tons that we can do about it, but let's get the messaging out there so that we can really start, you know, pushing people to make the changes and do things, so that right now we can start trying as a nation, as a community, to really make as much of a difference as we can today, whilst the other stuff is in process and in motion.
Thanks, Kerry. It's really great to have that perspective. And I think if there's for people who do feel a little bit overwhelmed by the information that's presented in the report, if there's one button that I'd urge you to press, it's the one right at the end, which is Find Your Member Rivers Trust, because that helps you to find out what's going on locally in your area, and how you can get involved. And of course, there's a lot of really great local groups that are springing up, and those supporting claims for inland bathing water status as well, groups starting to spring up around that. So we are just about out of time now, and I'd like to just hand over to Mark just to kind of close us off. And just before I will come back and thank you all, but Mark, in terms of your kind of next big step, what would you like to see happening next around the country, and including all of our efforts as well?
Yeah, well, I think it's been a great discussion. I think, you know, the thing that's come out of it is that you know, there are lots of problems, but also I think that the solutions require collaboration and partnership, and those are easy things to say and harder to do. And it feels to me that, you know, we really need to look at the way that the governance structures around our rivers. I mean, Olivia talked about the kind of democratization of data and processes, and Minister Powell talked a lot about, you know, about partnership working and things, and they're dead right, but we kind of need a clear mandate and some structures. There are lots and lots of different initiatives out there. You know, people who are called stakeholders get invited to lots of different meetings, and they don't know which one is the decisions are actually going to be made at. There are lots of plans and strategies which don't actually get implemented, but, you know, millions are spent on their production. So, you know, we really need a much clearer process for bringing together all these different initiatives, you know, like ELM and carbon offsetting and the water industry planning and the drainage wastewater management plans. You know, we need to converge those a lot more, so there's a lot greater cohesion and clarity and collaboration of initiatives. So for me, that's the sort of fundamental thing, is that we've got to think about this, you know, big wicked problem of river health in a much more collaborative and coherent way than we are at the moment. It's very piecemeal and separate. So yeah, thank you very much from me to all the panelists, and I'll hand back to you now, Christine. And very, very well done for all the work that you and the team have done on this report. I think it's amazing.
Thanks, and thanks so much to all of our wonderful panelists. It's been really great talking to you, to introduce you to the report and hearing the discussion today. And for everybody who's listening and joining us and watching this, just really encourage you to go to the Rivers Trust website. Under key issues, you'll find the State of Our Rivers report, and we intentionally called it the State of Our Rivers. You know, let's get involved and let's start renewing our rivers again, so that that's part of our natural heritage that we can really be proud of. So please do get involved with us and with all of the groups who are really trying to do something positive about improving the state of our rivers around the country. Thank you very much.